When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Morning decisions. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
The thing about Bose, though, is he kind of falls for the glamour of the dictators. In the 30s, you can see this happening. He slowly but surely falls out with Gandhi, who ends up calling him a demagogue, because he looks at what's happening in Russia and Germany. He admires Stalin, he admires Hitler, because these are men who have transformed their societies at the head of a paramilitary state. And for somebody in a hurry to transform their own society,
Drink? Now, shall we begin? Hello. During the Second World War, the cause of Indian independence was placed on hold for the Congress Party. But one man, Subhas Chandra Bose, was impatient for freedom. And so in a dramatic escape from a British prison, he travelled to Nazi Germany and Japan to throw his lot in with empires committed to fighting Britain. When the Japanese threatened to invade the British Raj, 2.5 million Indians volunteered to fight against them. But Bose led around 40,000 of his own countrymen against British India. Joining today is Phil Craig, author of 1945, The Reckoning, War, Empire and the Struggle for a New World, as we chat about Bose, the great Indian general Timmy, the Bengal Famine and much more. Coming up on the pod, we talk a pioneer of special forces, the murky world of ancient running during the Troubles, the great Athenian statesman Pericles, and much more. So please do share with friends and family. But let's head into the club with Phil Craig. Phil, thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you, Oliver. It is a pleasure.
Well, I wanted to speak to you because your book, 1945, this is for your paperback. It's out in paperback with cost of living and everything. Should be attractive to those who were tempted before but maybe put off by a hardback price. Now available, very reasonable price, I think, in paperback. And it is a fascinating book because I've been really enjoying refamiliarizing myself with it before I spoke to you. I wanted to ask you, I mean, this is, I guess for those the uninitiated, there are really kind of two main characters in the book, but there's so much more as well. But I wondered if we could start chatting about Timmy, who's maybe less familiar to people, and then also Chandra Bose, who's probably a little bit better known, but perhaps not as well known to certainly people in this country as people like Nehru and Gandhi.
Yes, I was familiar with a lot of the material in the book. The focus of it really is the East, India and the Far East, and imperial politics, imperial game playing, and of course the progress of the war. But I wanted to address the question of empire head on. So I think it's really central to understanding the war, Britain, and certainly the final year of the war. So I was so delighted to discover this chap Timmy. He's quite well known in India, in military circles, but I don't think really outside. Konandera Subaya Thimaya is his proper Indian name. He was known at the time as kind of Major Timmy, Colonel Timmy, and eventually General Timmy. Becomes the chief of staff, actually, of the independent India's military in the years after the independence. And he's an incredibly interesting character to get under the skin of what it was like to be a young Indian in the 20s and 30s, believing in independence, wanting to see in India governing itself, but also part of the establishment. His family were all quite well off, well connected. Many of them were in the military. He had a lot of love for the Indian Army, the British Indian Army, which he joined, and he was extremely good and rose through the ranks. He was identified as a future leader very quickly. Was sent to Sandhurst, which is quite rare for somebody from India. And throughout his whole life, certainly his life prior to 1945, he's struggling with these two competing forces: his loyalty to the army as he rises through it, and his belief in independence, and which made him a perfect character, I think, to explore this period and to intercut him with this guy Bose, who we'll probably talk about later, who was from a similar background but took a rather different view of how to get to independence. So Timmy is a brilliant fighter, a brilliant leader, a brilliant organizer. I start the book, in fact, with a description of one of his great victories in the early months of 1945. And I said I write it up as a sort of, slightly positive. This is a great example of, it's in a place called Kangor, where he fights his Indian troops, who he's commanding, fight alongside British commandos. It's a famous victory. He plays a very brave role. And I explain that, here's an example of the Raj at its best, the British Indian Army at its best, black, white, Africans, Indians, white people. But an awful lot more is going on, both in that battle and in Timmy's mind. His own brother, for example, breaks his oath of loyalty and joins the Indian National Army, which is Bose's army, to fight alongside the Japanese. So there you see within that one family the tensions and the pressures. Before the war, Timmy nearly leaves the army more than once, especially when he's asked to send troops into the street to police the independence demonstrations, supporters of Gandhi and Nehru and others. And as he says at the time, I've got my own friends out there, and my troops have got their brothers and their sisters out there. And we expected to fire on them. And he happens to be a friend of Nehru, not the famous Nehru, but the father, Motilal Nehru, who was like the patriarch of the Nehru family. And Timmy's a friend of his. And he goes to see him, so I'm going to have to quit. And he talks him out of it. It's the most important moment in Timmy's life. He says, we need men like you. India will need an army to hold this massive country together. You're a star. Learn how to rule, learn how to govern, learn how to organize a military on a grand scale. And he does, and he stays, and he fights. And he never believes the promises of the Japanese, which Bose, of course, does. He never believes that the way to an independent India is through a Japanese military victory. You can't build independence on the bayonets of Japanese soldiers, I think he says, or somebody says, and he agrees with that. But it's a near-run thing, and one thing I'll say, if I just give me 2 minutes for a personal anecdote that
please
made my day, which probably hadn't happened when we last spoke.
Right.
There are very few people in this book who are real players, because you'd have to be over 100. Unlike a lot of my previous books, where I did meet an awful lot of survivors of the Second World War. So I gave a talk not far from where I live, Hampton Court, and in the audience was a 104-year-old gentleman called Yavar Abbas. Now, some people may remember him. He was chosen to give a speech in front of King Charles on VJ Day, and he spoke about his happiness to represent the Indian Army and also his experiences of cancer. King Charles cried. It was quite a famous moment. That's him. He lives about 10 bus stops from where I'm sitting, and I'd never come across him. And not only had he served under Timmy, he knew him. He'd played bridge with him. An experience, he said, was almost as frightening as being under Japanese fire. You wouldn't want to mess up 3-0 trumps.
Was he a partner?
Yeah, I think so. Right. But Yavar was a perfect, and he said he'd read the book. He said, you've got it right, Phil. We were torn. I was torn. I had lots of friends who thought, this is the moment, the British are losing the war. Let's join in with the victors. Let's take our chance for independence. But like Timmy, I decided no. I couldn't buy that vision. But we all knew this would be it. They would have to go after this, which I think became explicit by about 43, 44. Anyway, he told me this wonderful story, if I'm allowed to swear on your podcast.
Yeah, of course.
He said, I've given a few talks. I'm not often upstaged by a man who's nearly 105. But he got up and he said, I want to tell you the story towards the end of the war. I don't think Timmy was in the room, but our colonel was, or our new general, or somebody. And we were having a dinner. I was a very junior officer, and this man was a kind of like a character from a book, a sort of red-faced Colonel Blimp, hated being in India, and he got up and he was very drunk. Indian Army was famous for this. He was very drunk, and he said, "Oh God, it's so hot. The food is terrible, and the flies, and I can't sleep. And God, I can't wait to get out of this fucking country." And Yavar said, "There was a moment of silence and shock, and I felt I had to do my duty as an Indian. And I stood up and I raised my glass, and I said, 'On behalf of all the Indian officers present, sir, can I just say we can't wait for you to get out of our fucking country too?'" Which is a lovely story, and actually kind of just shows you that we celebrate the Indian Army. We should. It has an extraordinary war. Slim is a genius. An army that is, what, 80% Indian. We celebrate it, but to really understand it and some of the pressures that are coming into play in 1945, you have to get under the skin of what it was really like, and how many people were fighting with very much mixed motives and conflicted feelings, even within families.
And this is something that actually should be quite a wake up for people who, I mean, the fact that Indians were willing to side with the Japanese against Britain does indicate that British rule, of course, you know, is not all cups of tea and everyone getting on well in India at all in the lead up to the Second World War. What was it that drove? What was it about British rule that caused all these feelings?
Well, there was a long build-up, of course, in the 20s and 30s. Men like Gandhi and Nehru, and of course Bose himself, Subhas Chandra Bose, one of the great voices and writers, very charismatic, of Indian nationalism. On the cover of Time magazine in 1938, ran the Congress Party before he threw his lot in with the Nazis and with the Japanese. He was very much seen as a future leader of an independent India. Yes, agitation, you know, which was repressed, sometimes quite ruthlessly. Protesters were shot, radicals were hung, usually if they had attacked, you know, British interests. It was getting, you know, and it was one of the great causes of Western liberals, independence for India. You know, Roosevelt, for example, in America, and all the New Dealers were completely in this, and it was, and as were many British newspapers and politicians too. Apart from Churchill, of course, in the 30s, who fights a kind of last-ditch defense against the Indian acts that are meant to spread more democracy in India. Anyway, that's a sidebar. But of course, think of what happens in the war. And this is why the loyalty of the Indian Army is a remarkable thing. It needs explaining. Think what happens in the war. First of all, when the Japanese sweep in, the British military, which was, you know, famously brilliant and ran everything and had this incredible navy, and had for years, it's the selling point was, you know, Britain will run you better than you can run yourself. Well, it collapses right through the region, humiliation after humiliation, and worse, in Burma, this disastrous retreat where there is endless examples of kind of racial prejudice, where Indian expatriates, and there were a lot of them, were not allowed on boats, and they were told to go to, you know, white people this way, Indian people that way, 1,000 kilometers through that jungle, chased by the Japanese, attacked by bandits, bitten by mosquitoes. You know, there was this real shock at that. Then you had the Quit India campaign, which Gandhi launches in 42. One of perhaps the biggest challenge to British rule in India since the mutiny. I mean, really savage stuff, thousands of dead, sabotage, explosions, shootings, assassinations, really savage. And then, of course, the famine, the Bengal famine, which people, you know, endlessly debate and talk about it in more detail if you want later.
Yeah, we would like
Certainly
to.
doesn't advertise British governance very well. So after all these disasters, it's remarkable that men like Timmy still decide that, you know, probably for the last time, they will stay loyal. And I think, you know, a residual level of loyalty to the regiment, to the military is part of it. A fear of the Japanese is part of it. And the Japanese never help Bose, really, because they behave so abominably. They're always massacring Indians and indeed anybody else. So if you're an Indian soldier and you read about these Indian nurses being bayoneted by the Japanese, then you get a leaflet. Come across to us, we'll create independence with you. So hang on a minute, you just killed my sister, you know, or somebody's sister. So there's that reason. But I think it's fair to say there are a lot of Indians who did feel that they were, every bit as much a part of the British Empire as a white Australian or a white Canadian. There was that residual sense of being excited to be part of something big, even though it messed up, and certainly preferring it to the insecurity and the fear of what the Japanese might do.
Well, the Indian Army is obviously hugely important to Britain throughout the Second World War, obviously in the East. Was there a concern, presumably there was, about moving too many Indian troops to the European theatre? Was that something that they had to keep in mind?
Well, early in the war, Indian troops have tremendous success in Africa and in East Africa and North Africa. And that's widely celebrated. That's before the Japanese get involved and the various disasters that I mentioned earlier. And there's an explosion of patriotism. People are marching, and there are cigarette cards, and there are movies, newsreels, and great pleasure in the success of Indians. We're fighting as well as any British man. We're warriors. And there's a surge of recruitment. 2.5 million people, and they're all volunteers. It's the biggest volunteer military.
It's an extraordinary number, isn't it?
Especially when you think that the bad things are going to happen. There is this surge of, what do you want to call it? Some people, who want to sort of disparage the British Indian Army, and a lot of them do now in India. They say, well, they were coerced, or they were poor. Yes, some of them were poor. A chance of a square meal, was attractive. But I think also the fact that you're joining a winning side, young men like travel and fighting and glory. And yeah, people like Timmy took a great deal of pleasure in the success of the Indian Army. So they were sent abroad. But as you point out, when things start going bad in the East and people start getting letters about, the Japanese might invade or people are starving in Bengal, there's a lot of agitation amongst the troops. And there are some quotes in my book, actually, of people saying, my men, this is an Indian officer writing back to India, saying, well, I'm expected to fight the Germans in the desert. Well, back in my home village, people are dying of starvation. What's going on? So they do try to minimize that. And of course, they need them all for the big fight against the Japanese, which starts in earnest. Well, it's running through 42, 43, but the really big one starts in early 44 with the invasion that leads to Imphal and Kohima, two very famous and extraordinary battles that the Indian Army played an amazing role in.
Yes, indeed. So Chandra Bose, we mentioned, let's just delve into him because he's an interesting figure. He's become, I don't know enough about Indian thought between sort of his death in 45 all the way through to sort of around, I guess, 1990, but he seems to have had a little bit more of a renaissance. Is that right, or am I completely incorrect about that?
Oh, you're very right.
Okay.
In modern India, and I think at some point I say this story of Bose is for me an example of how history can be very annoying. One has to study it and we have to understand it. In modern India, Bose is seen by many as the true hero of independence. And people like Timmy and the 2.5 million others are seen as something that they're slightly embarrassed about. Because at the end of the day, they served the occupying power. They served the colonial power. They were mercenaries, perhaps. They weren't fighting for India. They were fighting for the Brits. Bose was true to his faith in independence, no matter what it cost him. And Modi, the current prime minister, is a big fan of Bose. If you just put Modi and Bose into a Google search, you'll see Modi opening schools and statues and motorways named after him. If you fly to Calcutta, his power base, you'll land at the Subhas Chandra Bose International Airport. And young Indians, especially young and online Indians, if you get into this debate, and I have, you will get absolutely swamped by Bose fans. He was a charismatic man in life, and even more so in death. Many myths grew up about him because he never died. He escaped. He's still alive, But people are fascinated by him, and they do see in him this kind of pure independent spirit, which I guess the further you move away from the time in which these people live, and maybe the more you get your history through a 30-second emotional TikTok, the easier it is to sort of worship people like that. But those who had to live during the times in which they were alive, it was a lot more complicated. Because what Bose actually did was throw his lot in enthusiastically with some of the worst people in history. He goes to Berlin. After a very dramatic escape, the British had him locked up. He escapes. It's a sensation. He travels across India. The world's press is fascinated. His own supporters think it's thrilling. He turns up in Berlin. He just basically says, I'm with you guys. I'm an enemy of Britain. Even though he had quite a left-wing background. It doesn't matter. These guys are winning the war. They're going to remake the world. And I'm going to be the person that works with them.
And he's had a very Western education, westernized education.
He goes to Cambridge. Yeah, he had it all going for him. You know, he was like Timmy. He was a part of the Indian upper middle class.
Like Gandhi and Nehru as well.
Yeah, destined for great things. Very well educated, extremely smart, brilliant writer, great orator. You know, the thing about Bose though is he kind of falls for the glamour of the dictators. In the 30s, you can see this happening. He slowly but surely falls out with Gandhi, who ends up calling him a demagogue, because he looks at what's happening in Russia and Germany. He admires Stalin, he admires Hitler, because these are men who have transformed their societies at the head of a paramilitary state. And for somebody in a hurry to transform their own society, and who quite likes dressing up in uniforms and having banners and blazing torches, you know, that's quite seductive stuff. And it seems in the 30s to be working to a lot of people. You know, capitalism and imperialism, that's old hat. That's just given us horrible empires and the Great Depression. This is the future. And I think he very much sees himself as an Indian version of one of those transformative dictators, which is why he falls out with Gandhi. Anyway, he rocks up in Berlin. He hangs out with all he's basically treated as a foreign head of state. He's allowed to break all the race laws because he's married to an Austrian woman who's white, but the Nazis just let that happen. He's invited all these parties. He meets Hitler. He socializes with Himmler, with Goebbels. He's personal friends of two of the people who are at the Wannsee conference, where the final solution is decided. He visits concentration camps. He
goes with them, doesn't he, on a day trip?
He doesn't visit death camps, but he visits concentration camps. This is 42, 41. He's well aware of what's happening in the East after the Germans go into the Soviet Union.
We don't know what he feels about.
Well, he writes. He's challenged by some of his old comrades, saying, you know, we hear what's happening in Ukraine and Poland, and what's happening to the Jews, and this is terrible. And he says, it's quoted in the book, you know, whatever we hear about these men, they are our allies. What they do in another place is of no concern to me. I am concerned about India. It's my only focus. They can help us. That's it. You know, omelets, breaking eggs. These are dangerous men, but we need them. Wow, big thing, big thing. He then has another very dramatic story. He travels by U-boat all the way to Tokyo, throws in his lot with the Japanese, becomes the head of the INA, the Indian National Army, which he builds and expands enormously. But he's always got this problem, which is that his allies let him down. The Japanese let him down. There's a famous occasion where one of the places the Japanese take, it's the only part of India they do take, is the Andaman Islands in the Gulf, in the Bengal, Gulf of Bengal. And so he goes there with the Japanese military, runs up the flag, first free flag over Indian territory since the 18th century, he says. It's widely promoted, and it's even marked now in modern India. Just a couple of years ago, the Times of India did a big thing about 80 years since this amazing occasion. But within weeks of that event, the Japanese have murdered 50 of his own supporters for no particular reason. They just thought they were disloyal. And this happens to him time and time again. His own men are killed by the Japanese, and the Japanese start killing Indian prisoners and doctors. So even though he has to accept their leadership because he wants weapons and transport, they undercut his vision. And so when it comes to it, I think 20,000 INA troops accompany the Japanese for the Imphal Kohima campaign. He's convinced that the minute this Indian army enters India, all of the other Indians on Timmy's side will throw down their weapons, embrace their brothers, often their real brothers, and then together they will march to Delhi, and that'll be it. Doesn't work out like that at all. Japanese let him down. The Indians stay loyal, almost all of them. They're not conducive to his propaganda. And it doesn't help that the campaign unravels. His men start running short of food and ammunition. Disease sets in. The Japanese have got no air supply, whereas the British Indian Army has got a lot. And that's the most heartbreaking moment of his life. But the thing about Bose, though, which is why I say history is annoying, is that he was a much, much more successful propagandist than he was a military commander. So even though his men lose every battle, really, they fight, he's remembered as a great warrior. And as I say, as the real hero of independence. There was a 10-part Amazon Prime series, which you can watch. It's got real high-end Bollywood production values. It's dripping in sentimentality. And it's almost wholly wrong in what it shows. But it's very, very successful. And that kind of captures the way a lot of modern Indians choose to see, perhaps want to see, Bose and the story of that time, even though it's largely a fantasy.
Does it show his visit to Berlin and all the, making friends with Nazis?
It slightly touches on his connections, but very quickly moves on to more heroic battle scenes and more scenes of the RAF bombing hospitals and killing civilians and all that. So, yeah, nobody's made a similar series about Timmy or the remarkable achievements of the British Indian Army, and I doubt they ever will. Although, I am in touch with his family, and apparently one movie is under development. But, that is a problem. I would say, as Nehru did to Timmy, that Timmy's contribution to the new India was massively more important than Bose's. Because, as Nehru predicted, he helps build this remarkable army, commands it to victory, then helps take charge of the only thing that's holding the country together, really, in the years after independence, and becomes famous for peacekeeping missions, places like Cyprus and Korea. Amazing man, big hero, largely forgotten. Bose, morally compromised, total failure, national hero. Go figure.
It is amazing. And I wonder, there is an independence movement that's successful in 1947. So obviously there are many killed in the partition of India. But this is an independence movement that does succeed in splitting from Britain a few years later than perhaps many in the Indian National Army would have liked. But why is it then that people like Timmy are forgotten? And Nehru is very unpopular now, I understand.
Yes. I make it maybe a slightly specious comparison to how a lot of young Irish people have taken to hero worshipping the IRA again and liking bands like Kneecap. I remember in the 90s covering the peace process and how thrilling it was. The idea that these communities could find a way to put their differences aside, not forgive, but forget, move forward together. It was thrilling. And young people, especially rock bands, most famously that song Zombie, but other, U2 and others, it was like cool to be into peace. Because you were living in this horrific urban sectarian war and he wanted it to end. Fast forward 30, 40 years. It's easy to make a rabble-rousing TikTok or a pop video. Up the IRA! We were the heroes. We should, praise them. And if you're a young person and your only experience of that history is stories in a song or on a little clip on video, you can fall for that. Whereas your parents or your grandparents were thrilled when they were young at the idea of peace. It's just easier to support, like supporting a football team. And I think something similar has happened in India. It's years after the event. And if you're young and you're cool and you want to just say something a bit shocking, apartheid la bourgeoisie and all that, radical chic, and then, join the gang, sing the chant, and get up the noses of your parents. There is something similar there, I think.
Well, one reason why you get a bit of success on TikTok is probably talking about the Bengal famine, which has made the headlines in this country recently with do you know about this? The exhibit that was at the National Gallery,
Yes,
I think.
yes.
Which I think has now been taken down, which made a number of claims in a sort of art installation, art video. And with art, actually, I always find it's a little bit, it's art. So it kind of going beyond a prime show, which I guess is art, but this is really is sort of, quite literally art. And it is one of the claims made, and I forget the name of the artist, was that basically Churchill caused the Bengal famine. And I think it had, well, you debunk it you debunk Churchill's role in it, I think, in the book. But there's certainly the British administration has much to be embarrassed about. But I wondered if we could explore the famine a little bit, because it is a subject that causes a lot of attention, even now, so long after.
Yes, well, as it should. It was one of the greatest and the most shameful moments in the story of the British Empire.
Was it 3 million killed? Died?
Nobody really knows. Most people
Right.
settle on between 2 and 3 million. I should give thanks to my friend Professor Tirthankar Roy, who's an eminent economist in the LSE, an Indian chap, Bengali in fact, who gave me a lot of help and showed me lots of interesting information about the famine. The famine starts through natural causes, natural disasters, crop failure, typhoon. It's made worse by the fact that the places that would normally have rushed where food would have been obtained are now under Japanese control. But the British authorities, the Indian authorities too, but let's just focus on the British, especially the governor of Bengal. They are shamefully slow in noticing and reacting. And by the time they realize something dreadful is happening, it's already too late for a lot of people, because a lot of people lived on the sort of margins of society, on the margins of survivability. Their diet was only a few hundred calories on the side of health. So just taking away a few hundred calories from everybody a day, within a few weeks, people are going to get seriously ill. They were started showing up, and these are why it's so grotesque, because they start showing up in the cities, especially Calcutta. And these cities are actually going through a weird economic boom, and there are parties and dinners and cars and record stores. And then people, mostly white, not all, but mostly, are coming out of these beautiful places and restaurants, and they're seeing people dying in the street. And it's ghastly. And the governor writes some awful things, which is initially he's worried about the propaganda. Oh, can we not stop the people taking pictures of these? And then he reveals something that I think is rather instructive, which is that he sort of says, look, it's India. These things have always happened here. We'll do our best, but you could have taken pictures like that 20, 30 years ago. Well, that's terrible, especially if your claim to run this place is that you will administer it better than the locals. If that's your claim that you're making and then you're not, that's shameful. And when he gets to London, it takes a long time for anybody to realise. Churchill does realise. He does try and get food there. Some food arrives, but it gets caught up in bureaucratic bottlenecks. It doesn't get to the places where it's needed. And as Tirthankar and others have shown, there was food tantalisingly close by in other provinces, in other parts of Bengal, and it was just never organised enough to get to where it needed to be. Things get better when Wavell takes over as the viceroy, and he's completely shocked at how badly it's been managed. He says this is going to stain the reputation of Britain for eternity, and he's right, it does. So we should accept an awful lot of blame for bad administration, for just not caring enough to make it the priority. But that doesn't mean we engineered it. It doesn't mean Churchill wanted, as some people say, oh, Churchill hated Indians, he wanted to see them starve. No, he didn't. He said some very stupid things often when drunk. He was capable of saying very sentimental, loving things about Indians and some very foolish and stupid things, especially about Hinduism. He used to say things like, Muslims are warriors, Hindus are windbags. Terrible things, really. So that was the man he was. But he didn't want to see mass starvation. But the state over which he ruled reacted criminally slowly. And I'm afraid there are parallels. We mentioned Ireland earlier.
I was going to say,
There are
yeah, this
parallels
is
with the Irish famine in that prejudice, I think, about the rural Catholic Irish affected the reaction to that famine. And prejudices, I'm afraid, about the rural poor in Bengal affected the reaction to this. And it's worth pointing out that after independence, there was never another famine in India.
well, that's
One in
exactly.
Bangladesh, to be fair, in the 70s, that's a war caused that. But India, you know, it didn't have to happen. It happened because of bad administration. And yes, their minds were perhaps on other things, like a global war. But had the food run short in in Australia or New Zealand or Surrey, you just know it would have happened quicker. You just know it. So I think, those who seek to defend the imperial legacy, and there is much to defend, I accept that, have to see this as a loss, a big loss, a shameful episode. And I try to tell that story as fairly as I can. But I'm not going to join the foolish installation artists who want to pretend that it was engineered by some evil man in a top hat while smoking cigars lit by £20 notes, which is there. That's the image that's presented.
Yes, indeed. So, the famine today, obviously, online there's this kind of attitude, but what about the amongst people like Modi and well, do they view the famine as a kind of, another example of the British Empire failing?
Yes,
Or do they really go for Churchill as well, or,
I
or
don't think
both?
Modi has gone that far,
Right.
but I mean, I'm not an expert on what Modi's said about this subject.
Yeah.
But certainly within the Indian academic world, there's a lively discussion. There are some academics who argue that the British willful neglect. They didn't care. Others, like Tirthankar, take a slightly more balanced view, which is that it was a terrible disaster, but it's really maladministration, some of which was Indian, by the way. There was a locally elected Indian government, which was also criminally negligent as well. But I think the real villain of the piece, I'm afraid, was the staff of the then governor of Bengal, and then the people in London who it just took such an age to work its way to the top of the in tray. That's the real problem. There was also a shipping crisis. Churchill at one point asked Roosevelt for ships to get more food, and Roosevelt says no, can't spare any. But I think in modern India, it's just taken as a sign that the empire's day was done and it was time for the Indians to take over. And in that respect, I mean, you mentioned the horrors of partition, but in that respect, you know, the maintenance of a food supply was one of the big successes of independence.
Interesting that, yeah. Okay, so this is I mean, it's such an extraordinarily epic story that you've written. And I guess Bose amongst them. We talked about the kind of uh, certain conspiracy theory going on with the famine, but Bose himself, I think, is killed in a air crash, or is he?
Well, Bose had, I mentioned a couple of them, his famous escape from house arrest when he treks across India, his amazing journey by U-boat all the way to the Indian Ocean, where he transfers to a Japanese submarine all the way and then, Indonesia somewhere, then they fly
Yeah,
him.
there's plenty there to make an extraordinary Amazon
And a
Prime
lot of
trip.
people think he was planning another one. It's the final days of the war. The Japanese offered to fly him out to Japan, but he probably realizes that the game is up and he will probably be arrested soon. And a lot of his supporters think he was talking to the Russians, to the Soviets, and planning to sort of disappear and re-emerge in Moscow
For the hat trick.
for the hat trick. I don't think that's true. I mean, a lot of people were it was a plane crash, of which many people survived, and saw him not survive, and wrote it down and took his body and buried it, cremated it and buried it. So I think it's very likely it just was an accident. It's an overloaded plane, some technical failure. It crashed. He died. He didn't survive the accident. Others did. They saw him die. I think it's pretty clear he did. And actually, also for Bose's own reputation, he probably died at the right time. As a sort of historic figure of unsullied ideological purity. He never had to deal with all the compromises of independence and whatever would have happened. I don't think they would have. It was very difficult. A lot of his men were put on trial, famously, and I put this in the book too, the Red Fort trials. Many of his top lieutenants, some brilliant characters actually, who were really good figures in the book, they are put on trial by the Raj, by the British, as the independence negotiations are going on. And this just shows how complicated the story is, because the Indians themselves, including people who loathed Bose, like Nehru, say we shouldn't do this. These men followed the wrong lead, but they are patriotic Indians. They were fighting for independence, and independence we're about to have. We need to find a way of forgiving them. Maybe some short, a couple of years in prison, and then reintegrate them into society. And some of them, when they reach their home villages, are acclaimed and garlanded, even by the men who they had fought against. Because it shows there was a sort of, like I say, many of them were like brothers or cousins. There's a love-hate thing with the INA. And Nehru himself, who, as I mentioned, was no fan of Bose at this point, actually represents, he's a brilliant barrister. He represents these three men. And even though they're found guilty, there's such agitation. I mean, half of the Indian Navy immediately mutinies. There's such agitation that Allenbrook, who was in charge of the Indian Army, gets on the phone to London and says, you're going to have to let them go. And so they let them go. And they're carried through the streets of Delhi as heroes.
Amazing.
And would that have happened with Bose? I'm not sure. It would have been a very, very difficult. That would have been a very difficult one. I think there was such anger at him, they might have tried to hang him. Oh, I don't know though. It would have been a really very, very big problem, Bose, if they put.
Yeah, I imagine if they
had. He dies at a good time for himself, his reputation, and the other Indian politicians.
Very convenient, Phil.
Yeah.
But Phil, I wonder how he would look at modern India now with, of course, partition, well, two partitions ultimately. And how do you think he would think of these new countries that emerged in 1947?
Well, he would have enjoyed all the statues and Modi saying nice things about him. He was very, he saw himself as a historic figure, a kind of warrior prophet, because he was as much a philosopher as he was a political leader. He would be very disappointed at partition. I mean, for all his faults, he was very non-sectarian. I mentioned the three men who were put on trial. One was a Hindu, one was a Muslim, and one was a Sikh. He filled his own ranks without any discrimination, which was quite unusual, because the Indian Army itself was kind of had a certain amount of partition within it. Different units tended to be, either Muslims or Sikhs or Gurkhas or Hindus. He didn't believe in any of that, which is, to his credit, I think. So he would have been very disappointed. But maybe also it's a sign of how unrealistic he was. He thought just by the force of his own personality, he could hold this enormously disparate subcontinent together, whereas realistically, an awful lot of people who I respect say it was always going to split. I mean, maybe it didn't have to split in such a chaotic and bloody way, but it was always going to split. And I think that's perhaps the consensus amongst the sort of Indian historians I respect. Yeah.
It's an extraordinary story, Phil. Thanks so much for coming on. This has been
My pleasure.
Really enjoyable. And so, of course, links are in the show notes. Listeners, you know what to do. But Phil, thanks a lot and best of luck.
Thank you very much, Oliver, and I look forward to seeing you very soon.
Great.
Bye.
Bye.
We've come to the end of this club meeting, so thank you for listening. If you want to get in touch about club benefits, please do, either by email or on X or Instagram. Links are in the show notes. I've also included my Substack link so members can read articles I've written on various matters that may be of interest. The History Book Club is written and presented by me, Oliver Webb-Carter. Music is by listener Chat DMZ. Episodes continue next week and every week, so please do join, subscribe, and if you can provide the club with a 5-star rating, we would be delighted. In the meantime, I thank you again, and now I have to usher members out into the real world. Until next time.
I was